Imagine a quiet evening when something inside you finally breaks, not in despair, but in recognition. The masks you've worn for decades start to itch. The conversations that once entertained you now feel hollow. The life you've built begins to resemble a stage set, perfectly arranged but lifeless. You're not falling apart, you're waking up. Carl Jung, one of the most profound explorers of the human soul, called this the process of individuation, the moment when a person begins to shed the false layers imposed by family, culture, and ego, and starts the lifelong journey toward the true self. Jung saw this awakening not as a dramatic explosion of enlightenment, but as a slow unraveling, a series of small, irreversible realizations that make pretending impossible. For Jung, genuine spiritual transformation doesn't begin with light, it begins with honesty. The moment you can no longer lie to yourself, even in small ways, a deeper consciousness stirs. This is why awakening often feels disorienting. It's not a leap upward, but a descent inward, a confrontation with everything you've avoided seeing. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Yet he also warned, that privilege comes with loss. The more authentic you become, the less compatible you feel with the artificial structures around you. At first, you try to maintain both worlds, the outer identity that fits and the inner truth that calls. But as Jung observed, the tension between them grows unbearable. What once passed as normal now feels toxic. The friendships based on shared illusions, the job that rewards conformity, even the goals you once cherished, they begin to crumble under the weight of your emerging authenticity. You start to feel allergic to inauthenticity. It's not rebellion, it's evolution. The same way your body rejects spoiled food, your spirit begins rejecting anything false. Jung noted that this process often begins unconsciously. People don't decide to change, they realize they already have. And with that realization comes the beginning of what Jung called the path of descent, the sacred journey through which the old self dissolves so that the real one can emerge. In the chapters that follow, we'll explore the 7 things Jung noticed that highly spiritual people slowly, almost involuntarily, quit as they awaken. These are not habits you can force yourself to drop. They fall away naturally, like leaves in autumn, when you finally stop pretending to be who you're not. The 7 things the spirit slowly quits. 1. The need for constant validation. In the early stages of awakening, one of the first illusions to dissolve is the craving for approval. Jung observed that the ego survives on validation. It feeds on the praise, attention, and acceptance of others. But as consciousness deepens, the energy that once went outward begins to return inward. People who experience this shift often describe it as a quiet detachment. Compliments no longer thrill them. Criticism no longer crushes them. It's not arrogance, it's clarity. They realize that both praise and judgment are projections, reflections of other people's minds rather than mirrors of truth. Jung wrote that what you resist persists, and when you stop resisting disapproval, it loses its grip. This detachment can confuse friends and family. They might interpret it as indifference, but in reality, it's freedom. The awakened person still values connection, but not as a means to feel worthy. Worthiness, once outsourced, is reclaimed as an inner state. In Jungian terms, this is the ego's first surrender. The individual begins to integrate the shadow, the hidden, rejected parts of themselves, and in doing so, they no longer need external validation to confirm their worth. 2. The habit of forcing outcomes. The second thing that begins to fall away is control. Before awakening, most people live in a constant state of striving, pushing, planning, manipulating circumstances to secure a desired future. Society even rewards this behavior, calling it ambition. But Jung recognized that such control is often rooted in fear, the fear that life will collapse without our constant management. As the inner transformation unfolds, that fear starts to fade. The awakened person notices that the more they let go, the more life seems to arrange itself in mysterious harmony. What once felt like chaos begins to reveal a hidden order. Jung referred to this phenomenon as synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that arise when the inner and outer worlds begin to align. This surrender is not laziness, it's trust. It's the realization that your true power doesn't come from forcing outcomes, but from aligning with something larger than your individual will. You stop fighting the river and start learning how to flow with it. Gradually, the awakened person discovers a new rhythm, a balance between action and allowance. They still pursue goals, but no longer from desperation. Their actions become offerings rather than demands. 3. The desire to fit in. Perhaps the most painful, yet liberating, loss comes next, the need to belong in the way society defines belonging. Jung saw this as the crossing point between collective consciousness and individuality. For most of life, we are trained to fit molds, to belong to groups, ideologies, and expectations that make us feel safe. But spiritual growth exposes the cost of this conformity, the slow death of authenticity. When awakening deepens, fitting in begins to feel like a betrayal. The jokes that once made you laugh feel empty. The conversations around status, gossip, and trivial competition drain your energy. You start craving depth, truth, and silence. Jung often compared this phase to the dark night of the soul, a period of isolation where the old identity dissolves but the new one hasn't yet formed. Many people mistake this for depression, but in truth, it's purification. You are being stripped of everything that isn't real so that what remains can finally breathe. In time, this isolation transforms into solitude, a sacred space where your true self begins to speak. Jung believed that loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate what matters most. Once you awaken, small talk feels like noise, and silence begins to feel like home. 4. The addiction to certainty. One of the most subtle transformations during spiritual awakening is the release of the need for absolute answers. Before awakening, the mind is obsessed with control through knowledge, through labeling, defining, and categorizing. It wants to know why everything happens, and it fears the unknown as if it were a void. Jung warned about this obsession with certainty. He believed the unconscious mind, the vast sea beneath our rational thoughts, holds mysteries far beyond comprehension. The more we try to force certainty, the more we close ourselves off from the wisdom of mystery. The awakened spirit learns to dwell in uncertainty, not as confusion, but as peace. This doesn't mean giving up on knowledge or logic. Rather, it's about recognizing their limits. A deeper intelligence begins to guide life, a quiet intuition that often feels irrational to the ego but profoundly right to the soul. Jung might call this the emergence of the self, the archetype that represents wholeness and balance between the conscious and unconscious. As the addiction to certainty fades, fear loses its foundation. You no longer need to know the entire path before taking the next step. Faith, not as belief but as trust in direct experience, begins to grow. 5. The constant self-comparison. Another behavior that naturally falls away is the habit of measuring oneself against others. Jung observed that the collective mind thrives on comparison. It keeps people trapped in competition, envy, and self-doubt. But awakening dissolves the illusion of separation that fuels this cycle. When you begin to sense that every person's path is unique, comparison becomes meaningless. The energy once spent on jealousy turns into admiration. You stop asking, "Why not me?" and start feeling, "That's beautiful for them." This shift brings deep inner calm. You no longer see life as a ladder, but as a field, vast, open, and diverse. You understand that someone else's light doesn't dim yours. In fact, their success becomes proof that beauty and possibility are expanding, not shrinking. Jung would say this is when the ego begins to serve rather than rule. It's not destroyed, it's integrated. You still have ambition and individuality, but they are no longer poisoned by comparison. Your only competition is who you were yesterday. 6. The fear of stillness. Before awakening, silence feels uncomfortable. People fill every gap with noise, distraction, and constant movement. Jung wrote that modern life is an endless escape from the self, a desperate attempt to avoid the inner world. But when awakening unfolds, that avoidance ends. Stillness becomes magnetic. You begin to crave quiet mornings, long walks, and moments of simply being. What once felt empty now feels alive. You start to realize that silence isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of awareness. In this stillness, buried emotions rise to the surface: grief, anger, joy, awe. And for the first time, you allow them to move through you without resistance. Jung described this as integration, bringing the unconscious to light so that it no longer controls you from the shadows. The fear of stillness transforms into love for solitude. The outer world becomes less distracting, and the inner world becomes endlessly rich. 7. The need to be good all the time. Perhaps the most misunderstood stage of awakening is the death of the good person identity. Jung often spoke of the shadow, the hidden parts of us that society teaches us to suppress. These include anger, sexuality, ambition, and power. Awakening doesn't erase these traits, it redeems them. When you stop pretending to be purely good, you begin to see yourself as whole. You no longer split the self into light and dark. You embrace both as sacred. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This integration marks true maturity of spirit. You don't strive to appear perfect anymore. Instead, you live truthfully. You apologize when you must, speak honestly, and act with integrity, not image. The paradox is that by letting go of the need to be good, you naturally become more compassionate, more understanding, and more human. The return to wholeness. What happens after awakening? When the 7 illusions fade, what remains is not perfection, but presence. Carl Jung often described individuation, the final stage of inner growth, as the process of becoming who you truly are. It's not about becoming better or wiser in the worldly sense, but becoming real, undivided, authentic, whole. After awakening, life doesn't suddenly become easier. The challenges remain: loss, change, uncertainty. But the relationship with life transforms completely. You no longer move through the world trying to control it. You move with it, in quiet partnership. You stop chasing meaning and start living it. This wholeness expresses itself through paradox. You feel both grounded and infinite. You can experience pain without being consumed by it, joy without clinging to it. The inner and outer worlds, once divided, begin to mirror each other with a kind of elegant symmetry. Jung might call this the union of opposites, the reconciliation of light and shadow, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. The awakened person is not a saint or a mystic removed from the world. They are fully human. They still feel fear, love, anger, and longing, but these emotions no longer dominate them. Instead, each feeling becomes a message, a teacher. You begin to see that even suffering has purpose. It's the friction that polishes the soul. This stage is not about escaping the human experience, but embracing it more deeply. You live in alignment, not because you force yourself to, but because it becomes natural. Choices that once felt difficult now flow with quiet certainty. Relationships evolve from dependency to connection, from expectation to appreciation. In the end, awakening is not the destination. It's the beginning of true living. Jung's wisdom reminds us that the light we seek is not somewhere outside of us. It's hidden in the very shadows we were taught to avoid. The spirit's journey is not about becoming something more. It's about remembering what we've always been: whole, aware, and deeply alive. And once you touch that state, even for a moment, life is never the same again. As Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. That is the silent truth at the heart of awakening, the return home to yourself. If this journey through the mind and spirit has stirred something within you, a quiet recognition, a spark of remembrance, then stay with us. There are more stories, more truths, and more whispers from the depths yet to come. Subscribe, not just to a channel, but to a path, one that leads inward, toward the parts of you waiting to be seen. Let's walk this road of awakening together.